Private Alessandro Romano clutched his battered accordion case as the transport ship docked in New York Harbor, expecting the worst kind of treatment from his American captors. Instead, 3 weeks later, he found himself standing on a makeshift stage at Camp Upton, playing traditional Italian folk songs, while hundreds of enemy soldiers clapped along, their faces lit with genuine smiles. What happened between those two moments would transform not just Alessandro's understanding of war, but create an extraordinary bridge between enemies that no propaganda could have ever built. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The autumn of 1943 brought with it a bitter wind that cut through the thin fabric of Alessandro Romano's uniform as he stood on the deck of the American transport vessel Liberty Star. Around him, nearly 300 Italian prisoners of war huddled together, their faces etched with a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and the hollow emptiness that comes from defeat. Alessandro pressed his weathered accordion case closer to his chest, one of the few possessions he had managed to keep during his capture in Sicily just 6 weeks earlier. The 24-year-old private from the rolling hills of Tuscany had never imagined he would see the towering skyline of New York City under such circumstances. When he had enlisted in the Italian army 2 years prior, he had dreamed of defending his homeland with honor, perhaps even returning as a hero to his small village of Montepulciano, where his father ran a modest vineyard and his mother tended to their kitchen garden. Those dreams now seemed as distant as the Italian coastline itself. Alessandro's fingers traced the worn leather of his accordion case, remembering the summer evenings when he would sit on his family's terrace, playing folk songs while his younger sister Maria danced barefoot on the stone tiles. His father would sip wine from their own grapes, and his mother would hum along while mending clothes by lamplight. The accordion had been his grandfather's, passed down through 3 generations of Romano men, each of whom had used it to bring joy to their community during harvest festivals and wedding celebrations. As the Liberty Star approached the harbor, American guards began shouting orders in English, their voices sharp and commanding. Alessandro understood little of what they said, but their tone was unmistakable. He had heard similar tones from German officers during the months leading up to Italy's surrender, and he braced himself for what he assumed would be harsh treatment, perhaps even violence. Corporal Vincent Castellano, a second-generation Italian-American from Brooklyn, walked among the prisoners with a clipboard, occasionally barking orders to maintain order. Vincent's own grandparents had emigrated from Naples in 1902, carrying with them nothing but hope and a determination to build a better life in America. Now, nearly 4 decades later, their grandson found himself guarding men who might have been his cousins had circumstances been different. Vincent noticed Alessandro's protective grip on the accordion case and paused. Something about the young Italian's face reminded him of his own brother Anthony, who had been killed at Pearl Harbor. There was an innocence there, a sensitivity that seemed out of place among the hardened soldiers and seasoned veterans who made up most of the prisoner group. "What's in the case, soldier?" Vincent asked in broken Italian, surprising Alessandro with his attempt at the language. Alessandro looked up, startled by the unexpected kindness in the American's voice. "A grave una fisarmonica, signore, my accordion," he replied quietly, his English heavily accented but understandable. Vincent nodded and made a note on his clipboard. Unknown to Alessandro, this brief interaction would prove to be the first link in a chain of events that would transform his captivity from a nightmare into something entirely unexpected. The prisoners were loaded onto buses for the journey to Camp Upton on Long Island, about 60 miles from Manhattan. Alessandro pressed his face to the window, watching the American countryside roll past. The October landscape was not unlike Tuscany in some ways, with rolling hills dotted with farms and small towns. But everything seemed bigger here, more spread out, and the farmhouses were built in styles he had never seen before. Camp Upton had been hastily expanded to accommodate the influx of Italian prisoners following Italy's surrender. Originally built during the First World War, the camp consisted of dozens of wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, surrounded by tall fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned by soldiers with rifles, a constant reminder that despite any kindness they might encounter, they were still prisoners of war. As the buses pulled through the main gates, Alessandro felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. He had heard stories from other prisoners about the treatment of captured soldiers, particularly those who had fought alongside the Germans. Some spoke of hard labor and harsh conditions, inadequate food, and guards who took pleasure in humiliating their charges. The prisoners were assembled in the main compound, where they were addressed by Colonel James Patterson, the camp commandant. Patterson was a career military officer from Ohio, a man in his early 50s, with graying hair and steel blue eyes that had seen action in France during the Great War. He had requested the assignment to oversee Italian prisoners, partly because he believed in treating captured soldiers with dignity in accordance with the Geneva Convention, but also because his own experiences as a young soldier had taught him that enemies were often just young men caught up in circumstances beyond their control. "Gentlemen," Patterson began, speaking slowly and clearly so that those with some English could translate for the others. "You are now prisoners of war of the United States Army. You will be treated fairly and humanely. In accordance with international law, you will be provided with adequate food, shelter, and medical care. In return, we expect your cooperation and good behavior." Alessandro listened as one of the Italian officers translated the colonel's words. He found it difficult to believe that their treatment would be as benevolent as promised. In his experience, powerful men often said one thing and did another, especially when dealing with those who had no power to resist. The prisoners were divided into groups and assigned to different barracks. Alessandro found himself in Barracks 14, along with 29 other enlisted men from various Italian units. His bunk was a simple affair, nothing more than a metal frame with a thin mattress, a pillow, and 2 army blankets. But it was clean and dry, which was more than he had expected. His bunkmate was Corporal Giuseppe Benedetti, a wiry man from Naples who had worked as a street musician before the war. Giuseppe had managed to keep a small harmonica hidden in his boot during capture, and on their first night in the barracks, he quietly played a few melancholy tunes that reminded everyone of home. "You really have an accordion in that case?" Giuseppe whispered to Alessandro after lights out. Alessandro nodded in the darkness. "My grandfather's. I've been playing since I was 8 years old." "Then you and we should make music together," Giuseppe suggested. "Music helps a man remember who he is, even in a place like this." Over the following days, the prisoners settled into a routine that was far more comfortable than any of them had expected. They were awakened at 6 each morning for roll call, followed by breakfast in a mess hall, where they were served portions that, while not lavish, were adequate and nutritious. The food was unfamiliar, American military rations that bore little resemblance to the pasta and fresh vegetables they had grown up eating, but it was filling and prepared with basic cleanliness standards. After breakfast, work details were assigned. Some prisoners were put to work maintaining the camp itself, repairing buildings, tending to the grounds, and helping in the kitchens. Others were assigned to work in nearby farms, where local agricultural workers had been drafted into military service, leaving crops that needed harvesting. Alessandro was assigned to a work detail at the Morrison farm, about 5 miles from the camp. Edgar Morrison was a man in his 60s who had been farming the same 200 acres for most of his adult life. His 2 sons were serving overseas, one in the Pacific with the Marines, and another with the Army in Italy, the irony that was not lost on either Morrison or his Italian workers. Morrison was initially wary of the prisoners, having been influenced by wartime propaganda that portrayed enemy soldiers as dangerous and unpredictable. But as he worked alongside Alessandro and 3 other Italians over the course of several weeks, he began to see them as individuals rather than faceless enemies. Alessandro proved to be a natural at farm work, his experience helping with his family's vineyard serving him well. He worked diligently, never complained about the physical demands of the job, and showed genuine interest in learning about American agricultural techniques. Morrison found himself looking forward to the days when Alessandro was assigned to his farm. One afternoon in late October, as they were finishing the harvest of the last field of corn, Morrison approached Alessandro during the lunch break. The Italian was sitting alone under a large oak tree, staring off toward the horizon with expression of deep melancholy. "You thinking about home, son?" Morrison asked, settling down beside him. Alessandro looked surprised that the farmer had approached him for conversation beyond work instructions. "Yes, sir. My family, they have vineyard. This time of year, we harvest grapes, make wine for the year. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. My boys, they're about your age. Johnny's 22, serving somewhere in your country right now. Makes a man think about things, having enemy soldiers working his land while his own sons fight their countrymen somewhere else. Alessandro felt a flush of shame. I am sorry, Mr. Morrison. I know this is, how you say, strange situation. Strange doesn't begin to cover it, Morrison replied with a wry smile. But I'll tell you something, son. You work harder than most of the local boys I've hired over the years. And you're a damn sight more polite. War's a funny thing. Makes enemies out of people who probably would have been friends under different circumstances. That evening, back in the barracks, Alessandro found himself thinking about Morrison's words. The farmer's kindness had been genuine, without any trace of the condescension or hostility he had expected from his captors. It forced him to reconsider some of his assumptions about Americans and about the nature of the conflict that had brought him to this strange land. Giuseppe was sitting on his bunk, quietly playing his harmonica, when Alessandro opened his accordion case for the first time since arriving at the camp. Several other prisoners looked up with interest as he lifted out the instrument, its red and white pearlescent finish catching the overhead light. Madonna mia, whispered Private Francesco Rossi, a young man from Rome. I haven't seen a real accordion in months. Alessandro placed the straps over his shoulders and tested a few keys, adjusting the instrument after weeks of being confined in its case. The sound drew more prisoners from neighboring bunks, and soon nearly the entire barracks had gathered around. Play something from home, Giuseppe suggested. Something that reminds us of better days. Alessandro's fingers found the familiar keys, and he began to play Volare, the popular song that had swept through Italy in the months before the war intensified. His rich baritone voice joined the accordion as he sang the opening verses, and one by one, other voices joined in, until the entire barracks was filled with the sound of homesick men singing about flying away from their troubles. The music carried beyond the barracks walls, floating across the compound where it reached the ears of the American guards on duty. Several of them paused in their rounds to listen, surprised by the beauty and emotion in the voices of their charges. Corporal Castellano was among those who heard the singing. He stood outside Barracks 14 for nearly 10 minutes, transported back to his childhood in Brooklyn, where his grandmother had sung similar songs while making pasta on Sunday mornings. When the song ended and the voices faded, he found himself wiping moisture from his eyes. The next morning, Castellano approached Alessandro during morning roll call. That was beautiful music last night, Romano. You play very well. Alessandro straightened, expecting some form of reprimand. I am sorry, Corporal. We did not mean to cause trouble. No trouble at all, Castellano assured him. In fact, I'd like to ask you something. We're having a small gathering this Saturday evening for some of the local townspeople who have been supporting the camp. Would you be willing to play some music for them? Alessandro stared at the American corporal in disbelief. You want me to perform? For Americans? If you're willing. Colonel Patterson thinks it might be good for community relations. Help folks around here see that prisoners are just regular people caught up in a war they didn't start. That evening, Alessandro discussed the request with his fellow prisoners. Some were suspicious, wondering if it might be some kind of trap or test. Others saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate that Italians were civilized people deserving of respect and humane treatment. Giuseppe was enthusiastic about the idea. Music is a universal language, Alessandro. If we can make them see us as human beings instead of just enemy soldiers, maybe our time here will be easier. Francesco, however, was more skeptical. What if they want to humiliate us, make us perform like trained animals for their amusement? Then we don't do it, Alessandro replied thoughtfully. But Corporal Castellano, he seems like a good man. His family came from Italy, he told me. Maybe he understands something about who we are. After much discussion, Alessandro agreed to perform, with Giuseppe accompanying him on harmonica. They spent the next several days practicing together during their free time, choosing a program that included traditional Italian folk songs, some popular American tunes they had learned from the radio, and even a few pieces of classical music that Alessandro had learned from a priest in his village who had studied at the conservatory in Florence. Saturday evening arrived with a crisp October chill in the air. A small stage had been erected in the camp's recreation hall, really nothing more than a platform with a microphone and a few folding chairs. About 60 people had gathered for the evening's entertainment, including camp personnel, local townspeople, and several Italian prisoners who had been given permission to attend as audience members. Colonel Patterson introduced Alessandro and Giuseppe with genuine warmth, explaining that the performance was part of the camp's effort to maintain good relations with the local community and to provide positive activities for the prisoners. Alessandro noticed that many of the civilian attendees seemed curious rather than hostile, though some clearly harbored reservations about being entertained by enemy soldiers. As Alessandro stepped onto the stage, accordion strapped across his chest, he felt a moment of profound uncertainty. Here he was, thousands of miles from home, about to perform for the very people his country had been fighting against just months earlier. The situation seemed surreal, like something from a dream rather than the harsh reality of war. He looked out at the audience and saw faces that reminded him of people from his own village. There was an elderly woman in the front row who looked remarkably like his great-aunt Carmela, and a middle-aged man whose weathered hands and sun-beaten face marked him as a farmer, probably much like his own father. Alessandro began with a simple folk psalm, Santa Lucia, that his grandfather had taught him when he was barely tall enough to reach the accordion's keys. His voice carried clearly through the hall, rich with emotion and homesickness. Giuseppe joined in with harmonica accompaniment that added haunting harmonies to the familiar melody. The audience listened with respectful attention, but Alessandro could sense their initial reserve. These were people whose sons and husbands were fighting overseas, possibly against Italian soldiers. He understood their conflicted feelings about finding beauty in music performed by enemy prisoners. For his second number, Alessandro chose Danny Boy, an Irish psalm that he had learned from a British prisoner during his brief internment in North Africa. He had practiced the English pronunciation carefully, and his accented voice gave the familiar tune an exotic quality that seemed to captivate the listeners. It was during his third song, however, that something magical happened. Alessandro had chosen to perform Amazing Grace, a hymn that Giuseppe had learned from an American soldier before the war. As Alessandro's accordion provided the melody and Giuseppe's harmonica added harmony, several voices from the audience began to join in singing. The elderly woman in the front row was the first, her voice quavering but clear. Then the man Alessandro had noticed earlier began to sing, followed by others throughout the hall. Soon, nearly the entire audience was singing along, their voices blending with those of the Italian prisoners in a moment of unexpected unity. Alessandro felt tears welling in his eyes as he played. This was not what he had expected when he was first captured in Sicily. He had prepared himself for hardship, for hostility, perhaps even for brutality. He had never imagined that he would find himself making music with his enemies, creating something beautiful together despite the war that raged between their nations. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. Colonel Patterson returned to the stage, his own eyes bright with emotion, and thanked Alessandro and Giuseppe for their performance. He then made an announcement that surprised everyone in the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed here tonight is a reminder that music has the power to bridge even the deepest divisions. These men are prisoners of war, yes, but they are also talented musicians who have given us a gift this evening. I would like to propose that we make this a regular occurrence, perhaps once a month, as a way of bringing our community together and reminding ourselves of our shared humanity." End quote. The proposal was met with enthusiastic approval from most of the audience, though Alessandro noticed a few individuals who seemed less than pleased with the idea of regular entertainment provided by enemy prisoners. Over the following weeks, word of the Italian prisoners' musical abilities spread throughout the local community and beyond. Alessandro found himself approached by other prisoners who had musical talents they had kept hidden. Marco Vivaldi, a former opera singer from Milan, had a magnificent tenor voice, but no instrument to accompany himself. Roberto Santini had played trumpet in a military band before his capture, but had no access to his instrument. Giuseppe suggested that they approach Colonel Patterson about the possibility of obtaining additional instruments, perhaps through donations from local churches or community organizations. The colonel was receptive to the idea, seeing it as an opportunity to further improve relations between the camp and the surrounding community. Within a month, a remarkable transformation had taken place. Local churches had donated several instruments, including a battered but functional piano that had been sitting unused in the basement of the Methodist church, 2 trumpets contributed by the high school band program, and a violin that had belonged to the late husband of a local widow who thought it should be put to good use rather than gathering dust in her attic. The Italian prisoners formed what they called l'Orchestra di Campo Upton, the Camp Upton Orchestra. Alessandro served as the unofficial leader, arranging music and coordinating rehearsals during the prisoners' free time. The group grew to include 12 musicians playing a variety of instruments, with several additional prisoners serving as vocalists. Their repertoire expanded to include American popular songs, jazz standards, classical pieces, and traditional music from various regions of Italy. Alessandro discovered that he had a natural talent for arranging music, adapting pieces written for full orchestras to work with their limited instrumental resources. The monthly concerts became major social events for the local community. People drove from neighboring towns to attend, and the camp's recreation hall often filled to capacity. Local newspapers began covering the performances, with headlines like, "Enemy prisoners bring music to Long Island," and "Italian POWs win hearts with beautiful concert." Alessandro found himself becoming something of a local celebrity, though the attention made him uncomfortable at times. He was, after all, still a prisoner of war, and the unusual circumstances of his situation never allowed him to forget completely that he was being held against his will. Even if that captivity had proven far more benevolent than he had ever imagined possible, the success of the concerts led to other opportunities. Alessandro was invited to perform at local churches, community centers, and even at a few private gatherings in the homes of prominent local citizens. Always accompanied by guards, he began to see more of American civilian life than most prisoners of war ever experienced. It was during one such performance at the home of Margaret Whitman, a wealthy widow who had lost her son at Normandy, that Alessandro had an encounter that would profoundly affect his understanding of the war and his place in it. Mrs. Whitman had requested a private concert for a small gathering of friends, many of whom had also lost sons or husbands in the war. Alessandro was nervous about performing for an audience that had such personal reasons to view him with hostility, but Mrs. Whitman had specifically requested his services after hearing him perform at the camp. The gathering was held in Mrs. Whitman's elegant living room, with about 20 guests seated in chairs arranged in a semicircle around Alessandro's performance area. As he played a series of classical and popular pieces, he noticed one woman in particular who seemed to be studying him with unusual intensity. After his performance, as guests mingled and enjoyed refreshments, the woman approached him. She was probably in her 50s, elegantly dressed, with graying hair and intelligent brown eyes that held a mixture of curiosity and sadness. "Excuse me," she said in hesitant, but understandable Italian. "I wanted to thank you for that beautiful performance. My name is Catherine Morrison. I believe you know my father, Edgar Morrison." Alessandro's eyes widened in recognition. "Mrs. Morrison." "Yes, your father. He is a very kind man. I work his farm sometimes. He's told me about you," she continued, switching back to English. "He says you're a hard worker and a good person. I have to admit, I wasn't sure what to think about that. You see, my husband is serving in Italy right now, and I suppose I had difficulty thinking of Italian soldiers as individuals rather than just the enemy." Alessandro felt a familiar flush of embarrassment and uncertainty. "I understand, Mrs. Morrison. This is a very strange situation for everyone." Catherine Morrison smiled gently. "Yes, it is. But hearing you play tonight, seeing the emotion in your music, it's helped me realize something important. You're someone's son, someone's brother, just like my husband is to his family. The war put us on different sides, but underneath all of that, we're all just human beings trying to make sense of a world that's gone mad." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I wanted you to know that I no longer think of you as my enemy. Tonight, you were just a talented young man sharing beautiful music with people who needed to hear it. Thank you for that gift." The conversation stayed with Alessandro long after he returned to the camp that evening. Catherine Morrison's words had articulated something he had been feeling but had not been able to express, that the relationships he was forming with Americans were transforming his understanding of the conflict that had brought him to their country. As winter settled over Long Island, the monthly concerts continued to grow in popularity and scope. Alessandro and his fellow musicians began experimenting with more complex arrangements, incorporating elements of American jazz with traditional Italian melodies to create a unique fusion that delighted their big audiences. The success led to an unexpected opportunity. A representative from a New York City radio station contacted Colonel Patterson about the possibility of broadcasting one of the camp's concerts. The idea of Italian prisoners of war performing on American radio was controversial, but the station manager believed it would demonstrate America's humane treatment of enemy prisoners while providing TALS unique entertainment for listeners. After considerable debate among military officials, permission was granted for a live broadcast on a Saturday afternoon in December. Alessandro and his orchestra spent weeks preparing for the performance, knowing that they would be heard by thousands of people across the northeastern United States. The day of the broadcast was cold and snowy, but the recreation hall was packed with local supporters who had become regular attendees at the monthly concerts. A crew from the radio station had set up their equipment, and Alessandro found himself more nervous than he had been since his first performance at the camp. As the broadcast began, Alessandro welcomed listeners in both Italian and English, explaining briefly that he and his fellow musicians were Italian prisoners of war who had been given the opportunity to share their love of music with their American hosts. He was careful to express gratitude for the humane treatment they had received and to emphasize that music had become a bridge between former enemies. The concert featured a carefully selected program that included Italian folk songs, American popular tunes, Christmas carols in both languages, and several original arrangements that Alessandro had created, specifically for the broadcast. The performance was flawless, with each musician contributing to a cohesive and emotionally powerful presentation. The response to the broadcast was overwhelming. The radio station received hundreds of letters from listeners, most expressing appreciation for the music and admiration for the prisoners' talents. Several listeners requested recordings of specific songs, though the technology for such recordings was not readily available at the time. More importantly for Alessandro and his fellow prisoners, the broadcast brought their story to national attention. Newspapers across the country picked up the story, with headlines like "Italian POWs, broadcast from Long Island camp," and "Music bridges the gap between enemies." The publicity led to additional performance opportunities and, more significantly, to increased support for the camp's progressive approach to prisoner treatment. Colonel Patterson received commendations from his superiors for the innovative program, which was seen as an example of how enemy prisoners could be handled in ways that served both humanitarian and propaganda purposes. For Alessandro, however, the most meaningful response came in a letter forwarded to him through the International Red Cross. His sister Maria had somehow heard about the radio broadcast and had managed to get word to him that his family was alive and well, still tending their vineyard despite the hardships of wartime Italy. "Dear Alessandro," the letter read in Italian, "we heard your music on a radio in the village. Papa cried when he recognized your accordion, the same one that Nonno played at our harvest celebrations. Mama says to tell you that your music sounded like home. Even though you are so far away, we are proud that you are representing our family and our country with such dignity. We pray every day for your safe return, but until then, keep playing your music and remember that you carry all of us with you in every note." End quote. Alessandro read the letter dozens of times, carrying it with him during work details and pulling it out during quiet moments in the barracks. The knowledge that his family was alive and proud of him gave him strength and purpose that sustained him through the lonely winter months. As 1944 dawned, changes began occurring that would affect Alessandro's life at Camp Upton. Italy had officially joined the Allies, and many Italian prisoners of war were being reclassified as co-belligerents, a status that afforded them somewhat more freedom and the possibility of participating in non-BRS combat military activities. Alessandro and many of his fellow musicians were given the option of remaining at Camp Upton as co-belligerents or being transferred to other facilities where they might receive different treatment. The choice was not difficult for Alessandro. He had found a home of sorts at Camp Upton, and the relationships he had built with both fellow prisoners and local Americans had become too important to abandon lightly. The change in status brought new opportunities for the Italian musicians. They were allowed to perform at venues beyond the immediate local area, traveling under guard to concerts in New York City, Philadelphia, and other major cities along the eastern seaboard. These performances exposed them to larger audiences and more sophisticated musical venues, but Alessandro found that he often preferred the intimate settings of their local concerts, where he could see familiar faces and feel the personal connections that had developed over months of regular performances. Spring of 1944 brought news that the war in Italy was progressing in favor of the Allies, with German forces retreating northward and Italian resistance fighters cooperating with Allied forces to liberate their country. For Alessandro, this news was bittersweet. It meant that his homeland would soon be free from occupation, but it also meant that his time in America was likely drawing to a close. The prospect of returning to Italy filled him with conflicted emotions. He missed his family desperately and longed to see the hills of Tuscany again, to help with the grape harvest, and to resume the life that had been interrupted by war. But he also realized that his experiences at Camp Upton had changed him in profound ways that would be difficult to explain to people who had not shared them. He had learned to see Americans not as faceless enemies, but as individuals with their own hopes, fears, and dreams. He had discovered that music truly was a universal language that could bridge differences of nationality, language, and political allegiance. Most importantly, he had found that even in the midst of humanity's greatest conflicts, there were opportunities for compassion, understanding, and even friendship. The summer of 1944 brought a steady stream of special performances and events. Alessandro and his orchestra performed at 4th of July celebrations, church festivals, and community gatherings throughout Long Island and the surrounding areas. Each performance strengthened the bonds between the Italian prisoners and their American hosts, creating relationships that transcended the formal categories of captor and prisoner. One particularly memorable concert took place at the Morrison farm in August, during a harvest celebration that Edgar Morrison organized to thank the local community for its support during the challenging war years. Alessandro performed on a makeshift stage built from hay bales, with his fellow musicians arranged around him in the same field where he had worked during his first months at the camp. As he played traditional Italian harvest songs, Alessandro looked out over the audience and saw faces that had become as familiar to him as those in his home village. There was Mrs. Wickman, who had become one of the orchestra's most loyal supporters. Catherine Morrison sat with her father, her face reflecting the peace she had found in learning to see former enemies as fellow human beings. Corporal Castellano was there with his wife and children, the family having developed a genuine friendship with several of the Italian prisoners. During a break in the performance, Edgar Morrison approached Alessandro with a proposal that took him completely by surprise. "Son," Morrison said, "I've been thinking about what happens to you boys when this war ends. I know you'll want to go home to your family. And that's as it should be. But I want you to know that if you ever decide you'd like to come back to America, you have a place here, not as a prisoner, but as a friend and a neighbor." End quote. Alessandro was moved beyond words by the farmer's offer. The idea that he might someday return to America voluntarily, as an immigrant rather than a prisoner, had never occurred to him. Morrison's invitation represented a level of acceptance and trust that seemed miraculous given the circumstances under which they had first met. As autumn arrived once again, bringing with it the anniversary of Alessandro's first performance at Camp Upton, preparations began for what would prove to be the orchestra's most ambitious concert yet. Colonel Patterson had arranged for the performance to be held at Carnegie Hall in New York City, with proceeds going to support families of soldiers from both sides who had been killed or wounded in the war. The announcement of the Carnegie Hall concert generated significant media attention and some controversy. While many praised the humanitarian gesture and the unique opportunity to hear Italian prisoners perform in one of America's most prestigious venues, Others criticized the decision to provide such a platform for enemy soldiers, even those who had been reclassified as co-belligerents. Alessandro felt the weight of responsibility as he prepared for what might be the most important performance of his life. He understood that he and his fellow musicians would be representing not only themselves, but all Italian prisoners in American custody, and that their performance could influence how such prisoners were treated for years to Boca. Come. The concert, held on a crisp evening in November 1944, was a triumph that exceeded everyone's expectations. The orchestra performed a program that showcased both their technical skills and their emotional depth, moving seamlessly between Italian folk songs, American popular music, classical pieces, and their own unique arrangements that blended elements from both cultures. The audience at Carnegie Hall was more diverse than any they had previously encountered, including military officials, diplomats, prominent New Yorkers, and even a few Italian Americans who had come to hear music that reminded them of their ancestral homeland. The response was enthusiastic, with several standing ovations and calls for encores that kept the orchestra performing well beyond their planned program. The success of the Carnegie Hall concert brought Alessandro and his fellow musicians to national attention. They were featured in Life magazine, appeared on network radio programs, and received invitations to perform at venues across the country. But perhaps more importantly, their success demonstrated that even in wartime, there were opportunities for understanding and cooperation between former enemies. As 1945 began, it became increasingly clear that the war in Europe was nearing its end. Allied forces were closing in on Germany from both east and west, and it seemed likely that the conflict that had disrupted so many lives would soon be over. For Alessandro and his fellow Italian prisoners, this meant that the question of their future could no longer be postponed. Many of the Italian co-belligerents at Camp Upton were given the opportunity to return to Italy as soon as transportation could be arranged. Others chose to remain in America, at least temporarily, to take advantage of work opportunities that had developed during their imprisonment. A few, like Alessandro, faced the difficult decision of choosing between returning to their homeland and remaining in a country that had become unexpectedly welcoming. Alessandro spent long hours walking the perimeter of Camp Upton, thinking about his future and trying to sort through the complex emotions that the approaching end of the war had stirred up. He missed his family terribly and felt obligated to return to help rebuild the vineyard and the community that had been damaged by years of conflict. At the same time, he had built relationships in America that he was reluctant to abandon, and he had discovered talents and opportunities that might not be available to him in post-war Italy. The decision became even more complicated when he received another letter from his sister Maria, this one containing news that changed everything. Their father had suffered a heart attack during the previous winter, and, while he had survived, was no longer able to manage the physical demands of vineyard work. Their mother was in good health, but needed help maintaining the property and the business that represented their family's livelihood for generations. "Alessandro," Maria wrote, "we need you to come home. Papa tries to hide it, but I can see that he grows weaker each day. The vineyard needs someone with your strength and your knowledge of the old ways. Mama pretends that she can manage everything herself, but she cannot. We are your family, and family must come first, even when there are other opportunities that might seem attractive." The letter made Alessandro's decision clear, despite his conflicted feelings about leaving America. His family needed him, and his obligation to them superseded any personal desires he might have about building a new life in a foreign country. He would return to Italy as soon as arrangements could be made. But before he left, there was one final concert he wanted to perform, a farewell presentation that would thank the American people who had shown him such unexpected kindness during his captivity. Alessandro proposed the idea to Colonel Patterson, who immediately endorsed it and offered to help organize what would become the most elaborate and meaningful performance of Alessandro's American experience. The farewell concert was scheduled for a warm evening in May 1945, just days after the official end of the war in Europe. It was held outdoors on the grounds of Camp Upton, with a stage erected in the same area where the Italian prisoners had first been assembled upon their arrival nearly 2 years earlier. The audience for this final concert was extraordinary. including not only the local supporters who had become regular attendees at the monthly performances, but also military officials, representatives from Bari, the Italian government, journalists, and hundreds of people who had traveled from across the region to witness this unique farewell. Alessandro opened the concert with the same song he had performed at his first appearance, Santa Lucia, but this time his voice carried different emotions. Where once there had been homesickness and uncertainty, now there was gratitude and a mature understanding of the complex relationships that had developed during his time in America. The program included many of the songs that had become favorites during the orchestra's regular concerts. But Alessandro had also composed a special piece for the occasion, a musical arrangement that wove together traditional melodies from both Italy and America, creating a composition that seemed to symbolize the cultural bridge that had been built during their imprisonment. As the concert neared its conclusion, Alessandro stepped forward to address the audience in the English he had learned during his months at Camp Upton. His words were carefully chosen, reflecting the profound gratitude he felt for the unexpected kindness he had received. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the outdoor venue. "When I first arrived in your country, I expected to be treated as an enemy. I prepared myself for hardship, for hostility, perhaps even for cruelty. Instead, I found something I never expected to find in a prisoner of war camp. I found friendship, understanding, and the discovery that music truly has no national boundaries." He paused, looking out over the faces that had become so familiar during his time in America. "You taught me that even in war, there is room for compassion. You showed me that enemies can become friends when they take the time to see each other as human beings, rather than as symbols of nations in conflict. For this gift, I will be grateful for the rest of my life." Alessandro's final psalm was "Amazing Grace," the hymn that had first brought his audience to join their voices with his during that magical evening nearly 2 years earlier. As his accordion provided the melody and Giuseppe's harmonica added its haunting harmony, voices throughout the audience joined in singing, creating once again that moment of unity that transcended all the divisions of war and nationality. When the last notes faded into the warm spring evening, the applause continued for nearly 10 minutes, with many in the audience openly weeping at the emotional power of the farewell. Colonel Patterson presented Alessandro with a certificate of appreciation signed by military officials and local civic leaders, recognizing his contribution to international understanding and community relations. More meaningful to Alessandro, however, were the personal gifts he received from individuals who had become friends during his captivity. Edgar Morrison presented him with a bottle of wine from his own small vineyard, along with a letter of invitation to return to America as his guest, whenever circumstances might permit. Mrs. Whitman gave him a silver harmonica, engraved with his name and the dates of his American imprisonment, suggesting that he might pass it along to a young musician in Italy who could benefit from learning the universal language of music. Corporal Castellano, who had become perhaps Alessandro's closest American friend, presented him with a photograph of the entire Camp Upton Orchestra, signed by all the musicians and many of the American personnel who had supported their concerts. On the back, Castellano had written, "To Alessandro Romano, who taught us that music builds bridges stronger than any wall." The days following the farewell concert passed quickly as Alessandro prepared for his return journey to Italy. The process of repatriation involved extensive paperwork, medical examinations, and briefings about conditions in post-war Europe. Alessandro learned that much of Italy had been devastated by the fighting, with many cities damaged and the economy in ruins. Rebuilding would be a massive undertaking that would require the efforts of every able-bodied Italian. Yet even as he prepared to leave America, Alessandro found himself already planning ways to maintain the connections he had built during his imprisonment. He exchanged addresses with dozens of American friends, promising to write regularly and to stay in touch as both countries worked to rebuild their lives after the war. Several local musicians expressed interest in visiting Italy once civilian travel became possible again, hoping to experience the musical traditions that had influenced Alessandro's performances. Giuseppe Benedetti had decided to remain in America, at least temporarily, having been offered a position with a small recording company in New York that specialized in ethnic music. The decision had been difficult for Giuseppe, whose family in Naples had also suffered during the war, but the opportunity to build a career in music seemed too valuable to pass up. He promised Alessandro that he would return to Italy for visits and would help maintain the musical connections they had established. The journey back to Italy took nearly 3 weeks, involving train travel across the United States to a port on the west coast, then a long sea voyage across the Pacific and through the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean. Alessandro spent much of the journey writing letters to his American friends and composing new musical pieces that incorporated the jazz and popular music influences he had absorbed during his time at Camp Upton. When the ship finally docked at Naples in late June 1945, Alessandro felt a complex mixture of joy and sadness. The sight of the Italian coastline filled him with emotion he had not expected, a profound sense of homecoming that reminded him how much he had missed his native land. At the same time, he realized that he was returning as a changed person, carrying with him experiences and perspectives that would forever influence how he viewed the world. The train journey from Naples to his home village in Tuscany revealed the extent of the damage that Italy had suffered during the war. Many stations were still partially destroyed, bridges had been rebuilt with temporary structures, and the countryside showed signs of the battles that had raged across the peninsula. Alessandro saw refugee camps, abandoned military equipment, and communities struggling to resume normal life after years of conflict, but he also saw signs of hope and resilience. Farmers were working their fields, children were playing in village squares, and people were beginning the slow process of rebuilding their lives in their communities. The human capacity for recovery and renewal that Alessandro had witnessed in America was equally evident in his homeland. When Alessandro finally arrived in Montepulciano, he found his family waiting at the small train station, their faces showing the strain of the war years, but also the joy of reunion. His father had indeed aged significantly, his once powerful frame now bent and weakened by illness and hardship. His mother looked older as well, but her embrace was as strong and warm as Alessandro remembered. Maria had grown from a teenager into a young woman, her face showing a maturity that spoke of responsibilities she had shouldered during his absence. The vineyard had survived the war, though it had not thrived. Many of the terrace slopes needed repair, equipment required replacement, and the wine-making facilities needed significant upgrades. Alessandro could see that rebuilding the family business would require years of hard work and substantial investment. But as he walked through the vineyards on his first evening home, Alessandro felt a deep sense of peace and purpose. This was where he belonged, among the hills and valleys where his family had worked for generations. The experiences he had gained in America, the friendships he had formed, and the musical skills he had developed would all contribute to his ability to help his family and his community recover from the war. Over the following months, Alessandro threw himself into the work of restoration with the same dedication he had shown to his musical performances at Camp Upton. He repaired terraces, replanted damaged vines, and gradually modernized the winemaking process using techniques he had learned from observing American agricultural methods during his work details. But music remained an important part of his life as well. Alessandro organized concerts in the village square, bringing together local musicians and introducing American songs he had learned during his imprisonment. These performances became popular community events that helped lift spirits during the difficult period of post-war reconstruction. Alessandro also began teaching accordion to local children, passing on not only musical techniques but also the lessons about cultural understanding he had learned in America. He told his students about the American audiences who had listened with respect and appreciation to Italian music, and about the friendships that had developed between former enemies through their shared love of music. The letters that arrived regularly from his American friends provided an ongoing connection to the experiences that had shaped his understanding of the world. Edgar Morrison wrote about his farm and his son's safe return from the war, often including small gifts like seeds for vegetables that Alessandro might grow in his family's garden. Mrs. Whitman sent books and sheet music, encouraging Alessandro to continue developing his musical abilities. Corporal Castellano wrote about his transition to civilian life and his efforts to maintain the connections between Italian-American communities and the Italian prisoners who had remained in America. Perhaps the most meaningful correspondence came from Giuseppe, who had indeed found success in the American music industry. Giuseppe wrote about recording sessions, performances in New York nightclubs, and the growing American interest in Italian music and culture. He sent recordings of his performances, which Alessandro played for his family and friends, demonstrating the musical bridge that continued to connect Italy and America even after the war's end. In 1947, Alessandro received a letter that would lead to one of the most significant developments in his post-war life. A group of his former fellow prisoners, led by Giuseppe, had organized a reunion concert tour that would bring several of the Camp Upton Orchestra musicians back to Italy for a series of performances. The tour was being sponsored by Italian-American organizations and would include concerts in major Italian cities, with proceeds supporting war reconstruction efforts. Alessandro was invited to rejoin the orchestra for the tour, which would last several months and would provide an opportunity to reconnect with his musical colleagues while helping to raise funds for rebuilding efforts. The invitation presented both an opportunity and a dilemma. Participating in the tour would mean leaving his family's vineyard during a crucial period in its restoration, but it would also provide income that could support the rebuilding effort and allow him to contribute to his country's recovery in a unique way. After extensive discussion with his family, Alessandro decided to participate in the reunion tour. His father, despite his weakened condition, encouraged the decision, recognizing that Alessandro's musical abilities represented a valuable asset that should not be wasted. Maria agreed to take primary responsibility for managing the vineyard during his absence, having learned much about winemaking during the difficult war years. The reunion tour proved to be a tremendous success, both artistically and financially. Audiences throughout Italy responded enthusiastically to the orchestra's unique blend of Italian and American musical influences, and the story of their friendship during imprisonment captured the imagination of a nation struggling to rebuild its identity after the devastation of war. Alessandro found that performing with his fellow former prisoners brought back many of the feelings of camaraderie and purpose that had sustained him during his time at Camp Upton. The music they created together continued to represent the possibility of understanding and cooperation between different cultures, a message that resonated strongly with Italian audiences who were working to rebuild relationships with former enemy nations. The tour also provided Alessandro with his first opportunity to see how other parts of Italy had fared during the war. Performing in cities like Rome, Milan, and Florence, he witnessed both the destruction that had occurred and the remarkable efforts being made to restore cultural and economic life. The resilience and determination he observed reminded him of the qualities he had admired in his American friends, reinforcing his belief that human beings possessed an extraordinary capacity for recovery and renewal. When the tour concluded in late 1947, Alessandro returned to Montepulciano with enough money to significantly accelerate the restoration of his family's vineyard. But more importantly, he returned with a renewed sense of purpose and a clear vision of how his experiences could contribute to his community's future. Alessandro used his musical connections to establish cultural exchange programs between his region of Italy and communities in America. These programs brought young Americans to Italy to learn about winemaking and Italian culture, while sending young Italians to America to study agricultural techniques and business methods. The exchanges created ongoing relationships that benefited both countries and helped to maintain the spirit of international cooperation that had emerged from the unlikely friendships formed during the war. The vineyard gradually returned to profitability under Alessandro's management, producing wines that gained recognition for their quality and unique character. Alessandro incorporated some of the agricultural techniques he had learned while working on American farms, creating hybrid approaches that combined traditional Italian methods with modern American innovations. As the years passed, Alessandro's story became part of the local folklore, told and retold in the village as an example of how positive outcomes could emerge from even the most difficult circumstances. Children grew up hearing about the accordion player who had won the hearts of his enemies and had returned home with lessons about friendship and understanding that transcended national boundaries. In 1950, Alessandro married Francesca Rossi, a young woman from a neighboring village who shared his love of music and his commitment to rebuilding Italian society after the war. Francesca had heard Alessandro perform during one of his local concerts and had been moved by both his musical talent and the stories of his experiences in America. Their wedding celebration featured music from both Italy and America, with several of Alessandro's former fellow prisoners traveling from America to participate in the festivities. Alessandro and Francesca had 3 children over the following years, each of whom learned to play musical instruments and grew up hearing stories about their father's extraordinary experiences during the war. Alessandro made sure that his children understood the lessons he had learned about the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their nationality or the political circumstances that might divide their countries. The family vineyard continued to thrive, becoming known throughout the region for producing excellent wines and for the warm hospitality that Alessandro and Francesca extended to visitors from around the world. Many of Alessandro's American friends made pilgrimages to Montepulciano over the years, renewing friendships that had begun in the unlikely setting of a prisoner of war camp. In 1955, on the 10th anniversary of the war's end, Alessandro organized a special concert in his village square that brought together musicians from Italy, America, and several other countries. The concert was dedicated to the memory of all those who had died in the war, but it also celebrated the friendships and understanding that could emerge when people chose to see beyond the barriers of nationality and ideology. Colonel Patterson, now retired from the military, attended the anniversary concert as Alessandro's personal guest. The former camp commandant was deeply moved by the warmth of his reception in Italy and by the obvious affection and respect that Alessandro's community showed for his wartime experiences. In a brief speech during the concert, Patterson reflected on the unexpected outcomes that had emerged from what had begun as a routine prisoner of war operation. 10 years ago, we brought Italian soldiers to America as prisoners, expecting to simply hold them until the war ended, Patterson said, speaking in English while Alessandro translated for the Italian audience. We never imagined that they would become ambassadors for international understanding, or that the friendships formed in a prison camp would continue to flourish years after the war's end. Alessandro Romano and his fellow musicians prove that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are opportunities for bashta, light, for beauty, and for the connections that remind us of our shared humanity. The anniversary celebration became an annual tradition in Montepulciano, attracting visitors from around the world who came to hear music and to learn about the remarkable story of friendship that had emerged from wartime captivity. The event grew over the years to include cultural exhibitions, educational programs, and exchanges between students from different countries. Alessandro's story also attracted the attention of historians and journalists who were documenting the human experiences of World War II. Several books and articles were written about the Italian prisoners at Camp Upton, and Alessandro was frequently interviewed about his experiences. He always emphasized that his story was not unique, that similar examples of humanity and understanding had occurred throughout the war, wherever people chose to see beyond the propaganda and stereotypes that divided nations. In 1960, Alessandro received an invitation that represented the fulfillment of a dream he had harbored for 15 years. The city of New York, in cooperation with Italian-American organizations, invited him to return to America for a special concert at Carnegie Hall, commemorating the 15th anniversary of the historic performance by the Camp Upton Orchestra. The invitation sparked intense excitement in Alessandro's family and community. Francesca encouraged him to accept, recognizing how much the trip would mean to him and understanding the importance of maintaining the connections that had shaped his life so profoundly. Their children were eager to hear about America from their father's first-hand experience, and the entire village seemed to take pride in the recognition being accorded to their local hero. The return trip to America was emotionally overwhelming for Alessandro. Landing at New York's airport and seeing the familiar skyline brought back floods of memories from his time as a prisoner. But this time, he was arriving as a free man, an honored guest, and a symbol of the enduring friendships that could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. The Carnegie Hall concert was a triumph that exceeded even the success of the original 1944 performance. Alessandro was joined on stage by Giuseppe and several other surviving members of the original Camp Upton Orchestra, their music demonstrating the lasting power of the bonds they had formed during their imprisonment. The audience included many of the same people who had supported the Italian prisoners during the war, their faces now showing the years that had passed, but their enthusiasm for the music as strong as ever. Edgar Morrison, now in his 80s but still vigorous, introduced Alessandro to the audience with words that summarized the extraordinary journey they had all shared. 15 years ago, Alessandro Romano came to our community as a prisoner of war. Tonight, he returns as a friend, a symbol of reconciliation, and a reminder that music truly has the power to build bridges between any people willing to listen with open hearts. The concert featured many of the same songs that had been performed during the war years, but Alessandro had also composed new pieces that reflected his experiences returning to Italy and rebuilding his life after the Sama War. The music demonstrated the evolution of his artistry while maintaining the emotional authenticity that had first captured American audiences during his imprisonment. After the concert, Alessandro spent several weeks traveling throughout the United States, visiting former guards from Camp Upton, performing at smaller venues, and reconnecting with the people and places that had shaped his understanding of America. He was struck by the changes that had occurred in the 15 years since the war's end, the prosperity that had transformed American society, the technological advances that were changing daily life, and the growing cultural sophistication that was evident in cities and towns across the country. But he was most impressed by the continuity of the friendships he had formed during the war. Despite the years that had passed and the different paths their lives had taken, the bonds created through shared musical experiences remained strong and meaningful. These relationships provided proof that the human connections formed during his imprisonment had been genuine rather than merely expedient, representing authentic friendship rather than wartime convenience. The American visit concluded with a special ceremony at Camp Upton, where a memorial plaque was dedicated honoring the Italian prisoners who had served there and the American personnel who had treated them with humanity and respect. Alessandro was invited to speak at the dedication, and his words captured the essence of what the Camp Upton experience had meant to all who participated in it. "This place changed my life in ways I never could have imagined," Alessandro said, standing before an audience that included former prisoners, guards, and local residents. "I came here as an enemy, and discovered that enemies could become friends when they took the time to see each other as human beings. I learned that music has no nationality, that kindness has no borders, and that understanding can flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. These lessons have guided my life for 20 years, and they will continue to guide me until my last day." Alessandro returned to Italy with renewed energy and purpose, using his American experiences to further develop the cultural exchange programs he had established. The success of his return visit had generated significant publicity in both countries, creating new opportunities for cooperation and understanding between Italian and American communities. Over the following decades, Alessandro continued to perform, teach, and advocate for international understanding through music. His vineyard remained successful, providing the financial stability that allowed him to pursue his musical and educational activities. His children grew up to become accomplished musicians themselves, carrying forward the traditions their father had established while developing their own unique artistic voices. In 1975, 30 years after the end of World War II, Alessandro was invited to participate in a special documentary film about the experiences of Italian prisoners of war in America. The film featured interviews with surviving prisoners and guards, archival footage from Camp Upton, and performances of the music that had brought them together during the war years. During his interview for the documentary, Alessandro reflected on the long-term impact of his experiences as a prisoner of war. "People often ask me if I regret the years I spent in captivity," he said, his hair now silver, but his eyes still bright with the passion that had sustained him throughout his remarkable journey. "How can I regret experiences that taught me so much about humanity, that brought me friendships that have lasted a lifetime, and that showed me the power of music to transform even the most difficult circumstances?" The documentary was broadcast internationally and brought Alessandro's story to a new generation of viewers who had no personal memory of World War II. Young people in both Italy and America were inspired by the example of reconciliation and understanding that Alessandro represented, and many wrote to him expressing their desire to build similar bridges between different cultures and communities. Alessandro's health remained good well into his 70s, allowing him to continue performing and teaching. He established a music school in Montepulciano that attracted students from around the world, many of whom came specifically to learn from the man whose story had become legendary in international music circles. The school emphasized not only musical technique but also the brave, philosophical and emotional aspects of performance that Alessandro had discovered during his time at Camp Upton. Students learned that music was more than entertainment or artistic expression. It was a form of communication that could transcend language, culture, and political divisions. Many of Alessandro's students went on to become professional musicians, but more importantly, they carried with them the lessons about human understanding and international cooperation that he had learned during his imprisonment. The ripple effects of his wartime experiences continued to spread through successive generations of musicians and music lovers. In 1985, 40 years after his return to Italy, Alessandro was honored by the Italian government for his contributions to international cultural relations. The ceremony was held in Rome, with representatives from numerous countries attending to recognize his lifetime of work, promoting understanding between nations through music. During his acceptance speech, Alessandro returned to the themes that had guided his life since his days at Camp Upton. Music taught me that there are no enemies, only people who have not yet discovered their common humanity, he said. Every song we share, every melody we create together, every moment we spend listening to each other with open hearts, brings us closer to the world we all desire. A world where understanding replaces suspicion, where friendship conquers fear, and where the beauty we create together proves stronger than the forces that would divide us. Alessandro Romano died peacefully in 1992, surrounded by his family in the same village where he had been born 73 years earlier. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people from around the world, including surviving members of the Camp Upton Orchestra, former American guards who had become lifelong friends, and students whose lives had been touched by his music and his message. The vineyard continues to operate under the management of his children, and the music school he established remains active, continuing to attract students who want to learn not only about music, but about the power of art to build bridges between different cultures. The annual concert in Montepulciano still takes place each summer, now attracting thousands of visitors who come to celebrate the legacy of understanding and friendship that Alessandro created. Alessandro's story remains relevant today, in a world still divided by conflicts and misunderstandings between nations and cultures. His example demonstrates that even in the darkest circumstances, there are opportunities for human connection and understanding. The accordion he played at Camp Upton is now displayed in a museum dedicated to his memory. But the real legacy of Alessandro Romano lives on in the countless lives that have been touched by his message of hope, reconciliation, and the transformative power of music to unite hearts across any divide.